Every start of a new NBA season offers a chance for players to take their games to new heights in varying degrees. Obviously, there are plenty of players who have already solidified themselves in their team's rotations, whether they be the stars leading the way or the complementary role players, but there are also always quite a few guys fighting to prove that they even belong, which is what today's video will be pertaining to. Unfortunately, today we're here to discuss 4 young NBA players that entered the year seemingly on the path of being a draft bust, and so far are failing to prove those allegations to be wrong. These players were all drafted fairly early on under the assumption that they could be competent and productive players, and in some cases even potential stars, but instead they're falling way short of expectations. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but it also very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. The first player failing to beat the bust allegations this season is Scoot Henderson of the Portland Trail Blazers. This one really hurts me to have to discuss because I'll raise my hands and be the first to admit that I was incredibly high on him as a draft prospect coming from the G League Ignite program. This is a player who was the youngest player to ever play in a G League game, finishing high school earlier so he could join the Ignite program at just 17 years old, and as a 17-year-old was not only holding his own, but was genuinely producing at a pretty impressive rate against professional athletes. He has a naturally strong build as a 6'3" guard. He showed off some ridiculously explosive burst and athleticism in his 2 seasons in the G League, attacking the basket in a way many were comparing to Russell Westbrook. He averaged 21 points per game in his second G League season, shooting the ball pretty efficiently at just 18 years old, and in the showcase games held against Victor Wembanyama's overseas club team, there were stretches where it was Scoot looking like the best player on the court. So for him to now be a genuinely worrying prospect on the verge of becoming a bust is just baffling, but it is the unfortunate truth. Henderson's production on paper may not look completely catastrophic, putting up about 10 points and 5 assists per game, but diving even one layer deeper uncovers so many issues. He's incredibly inefficient and just a bad, unreliable shooter, which is tough in a modern NBA so focused on prioritizing shooting. It's a lot more difficult for him to attack the basket when defenses know they don't necessarily have to worry about his jumper. He's been an absolute mess on defense, with the worst individual defensive rating on the Blazers team, which is filled with bad defenders, and overall, the Blazers, who are already a pretty bad team as is, perform 5.6 points worse per 100 possessions with Henderson on the floor. His situation is reminiscent of Killian Hayes of the Pistons, as Hayes, like Henderson, showed flashes of being a pretty decent passer, but struggled in nearly every other facet of the game before eventually flaming out. The next player failing to beat the bust allegations this season is Jabari Smith Jr. of the Houston Rockets. It may not sound fair to include Jabari on a list like this at first glance, but it's hard not to be disappointed with what Jabari is at this point compared to what he was expected to be when he was drafted. For a lot of the pre-draft process in 2022, Smith was viewed as the best prospect in the class, and even days before the draft went down, most mock drafts had him being selected first overall, with a few reports coming out that the Magic were locked in on taking him. Instead, obviously, Paolo Banchero did end up being selected first overall, and Jabari slipped down to the 3rd pick, but even being taken in the top 3 comes with pretty lofty expectations. Jabari was looking like a two-way stud who could score from all 3 levels and provide absolutely elite defensive impact. He was being compared to players like Chris Bosh as a prospect who was a multiple-time All-Star and NBA champion in his prime, but now in year 3, Jabari is regressing and his offensive game is severely more limited than initially thought. In hindsight, when you go back and watch his college tape at Auburn, you do see a player who struggled mightily to create any kind of separation off the dribble, which should have been more of a warning sign, but he was such an impressive shot maker even while being heavily contested that it got overlooked. Jabari is averaging about 11 points and 7 rebounds per game as the Rockets' starting power forward, shooting a league average 36% from 3, and is basically just a catch-and-shoot guy with a few post-ups here and there as well. The label bust doesn't always mean a player is a complete failure, because Jabari is definitely not a complete failure by any means, but he was a top 3 pick in a pretty loaded draft class, and his ceiling is now as a defensive stopper who realistically should only be about a 4th option on offense at any given time, when he was originally viewed as a potential two-way star. The next player failing to beat the bust allegations is Moses Moody of the Golden State Warriors. Moody is now in his 4th season with the Warriors after being selected in the lottery back in 2021, and it's once again looking like the same old story. Coming out of Arkansas, he seemed to embody the perfect 3-and-D archetype while also showing off some promising shot creation potential, and that kind of archetype is a hot commodity. Being drafted to a team that would go on to win the finals in 2022 probably wasn't the best starting point for a player like this, because his development wasn't always prioritized in a win-now rotation, and it can be tough for a young player to grow if they're held on a tight leash at all times. Last season, minutes opened up and he started to play on a slightly more consistent basis, but he's never been quite able to get on Coach Steve Kerr's good side, and his minutes have always fluctuated. This offseason, Moody did sign a 3-year extension with the Warriors, and he entered the year hoping to play an even bigger role with Klay Thompson leaving, but instead, Moody is playing fewer minutes than he did last year, and in the opportunities that he's getting, he's just not doing enough to prove that he deserves more. He's a league average shooter who is capable of playing good on-ball defense, but struggles with rotational awareness and consistency making the right reads. He's not very creative with the ball in his hands, and when you look deeper at his impact, you see the Warriors are actually a whopping 11.2 points worse per 100 possessions with him on the court. So overall, that combined with his 7 points per game is just not good enough for a lottery pick. And finally, the last player failing to beat the bust allegations this season is Jett Howard of the Orlando Magic. The Magic are one of the league's most promising young teams on the rise, and so many of the decisions that they've made over the last few years have been on the money, contributing to their current prominence. The 2023 NBA draft, however, was a bit of a miss for them. They had 2 selections in the lottery that year, taking Anthony Black and Jett Howard with the picks, and when you look at how much quality talent was available around them, it's enough to make Magic fans cringe a bit in hindsight. Jett Howard was the 11th pick selected immediately, before guys like Derek Lively, Grady Dick, Jordan Hawkins, Keontae George, and Jaime Jaquez, yet in his 2nd season, Jett Howard still doesn't look anything close to an NBA-level player. Starting the year at full strength, he wasn't even a real part of the Magic's rotation, but now as a result of some injuries to a few guys on the team, he's getting a shot to play on a nightly basis. The output is still leaving a lot to be desired, though. He was drafted to be a scoring threat coming out of Michigan, yet he's only putting up 4 points per game, shooting the ball 37% from the field and 31% from 3. He does hold his own on defense, so he deserves credit there, but he's far and away the worst lottery pick of the 2023 class, and in all likelihood, when the injured Magic players return to the court, Howard will be the one to go right back to the end of the bench. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what you think about these young players moving forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.